Previously, I did a video on the Extron cross-point series of switchers, which allow you to take a number of inputs of any kind of analog signal you can think of, from RGB all the way down to composite, and output them to any number of outputs, either a single input to multiple outputs or a bunch of different inputs to a bunch of different outputs. Now you can control this from the buttons that are on the front of the panel, which gets a little confusing, and if you're lazy like me, you may not want to have to get up to change inputs every time, so you might want to instead use the web interface. But the web interface, again, has some labeling issues, potentially, and also requires you to use a computer. So as a sort of more convenient and, most importantly, cooler looking option, you can use an Extron touch panel in order to control everything. Here's an example of my touch panel. You can see that it's fully customizable with your own images, backgrounds, button sizes, things like that. You can also see that not only can I control my switcher with all my different consoles and whatnot, but I can also control my TV through this as far as the power and muting and input are concerned. So that's something that we'll talk about as well. So we're going to cover exactly what hardware we need to accomplish this. You need the touch panel, as well as some other pieces of hardware and wiring. We'll talk about how to set up the touch panel itself, so we're going to create our own little layout and upload it to the touch panel. And then I'll also show you how to configure the other pieces of hardware that you need. So not just the touch panel, but some other hardware needs to be configured, which is really the brains of this whole thing. The touch panel is actually just a front end for some other pieces of equipment. Let's talk about the actual hardware that we need. The first piece of hardware that we need is the actual touch panel itself. The touch panels are referred to as the Extron TLP series. So you'll see these TLP Pros, and then you'll see just the regular TLPs. Now you do not want to buy a TLP Pro. You cannot use this unless you have an account with Extron. You cannot just get an account with Extron. I work in the AV industry, and even I haven't been able to get an account with Extron very easily. But if you see something like this TLP 710 or a TLP 1000, which is the one that I have, these will work just fine. Now, if we look for the TLP 1000, which is what I bought, I got mine for around $65. You can see that these are obviously way more expensive, but there's a few things that you can do. First off, with the best offer, usually people will accept 20 or 30 bucks under whatever it's listed at. And more importantly, if you are just patient, you'll see that, you know, every so often these get listed for much cheaper. If we go to sold items for the TLPs, you can see we have this best offer taken here, which I think this was actually the one that I purchased. We can also look for the TLP 700. So if you look at this one, this is the 7-inch version. I have the 10-inch version, but this one sold for $24 plus 15 shipping, $45 plus 15 shipping. And you know, all these are best offer too, so you could have probably gotten a little bit off. It's not as expensive as you might think when you first start looking around for these. Just keep in mind that you need to be kind of patient if you want to get a really good deal. You also want to make sure that these come with the power supply, or that you're comfortable wiring up your own power. As you can see, it uses this little orange connector here, and this is called a Phoenix connector, and all that little cable is a positive and a negative wire going to a 12-volt power supply. Now, the controller box that we also need to purchase can supply this 12 volts to the touchscreen, so that whenever you turn on the controller, the touchscreen turns on as well. However, you're probably going to need to wire up some speaker wire between two of these little orange connectors that you see, which are just screw post connectors, between the controller and the touch panel. That's what I did in my case, but you have to be comfortable doing something like that. Once we get the touchscreen, we also need the controller box that's going to actually run everything in the background, and that's the Extron IPCP. Now again, you're going to want to look for things that don't say Pro. The only one that I know of off the top of my head that will work, that isn't in the Pro line, is the 505. So let's look up the 505. Here we go. And you can see that these are much more affordable. Now, you don't need a special power supply to run these. They have a built-in PSU. You can see it just uses a computer power cable. The touch panel also has a LAN port, as well as this one, so keep in mind that you're going to need 2 Ethernet cables and 2 ports on your switch. You can see on the left, we have these orange connectors here, which is that 12-volt power. If you're wondering how you actually get anything plugged into all of these ports, which we will need to do with potentially the power, maybe some serial ports in the future, maybe one of these IR ports, you're going to need what are called Phoenix connectors. If we pull up some of these other ones, let's take a look and see if we can find one that has them attached already. Here we go. This is a good example. This one right here has all of the serial IR ports filled up, which are the 2 pins, and then 2 of the 5-pin COM serial ports are filled in over here. So we want to look for one that has all of these already in it. You can see this one here already has a bunch of them connected, and you want to confirm with the seller that it'll come with these. What I would do is make sure that I have at least 4 of these little 2-pin ones, and at least a couple of either these 5 pins or these 3 pins here. You'll want a couple of serial connections, which are going to be these ones that say COM on them. And then you'll want a few for the IR, and you can also use these 2-pin blue ones as the power, which you'll also want to use. I personally use one of these little 2 pins for a power for my touch panel, and I needed a second one on the panel side, which is something you need to keep in mind. And then I'm going to be using probably 3 or 4 of these serial ports for some really stupid stuff that I'm doing. This IPCP 505 box, I'm going to refer to it as the controller or the control box from now on. And what the controller is going to do is take all of your different devices, whether they're Extron or just a generic serial device or an IR emitter, and it'll basically act as a central hub for all of those devices. It'll also allow us to control the mister through one of these serial ports, which is going to be important for a later video, and we can use it to provide power, of course. That's what this box does. So this is the controller for everything, and then the touch panel is basically just a screen that sends commands back to the 505 box, and this box is what's actually doing all of the, computing of what the touchscreen is sending. Let's talk about the software that we need to set up both of those devices. To create the graphics and buttons on the touch panel, we need the GUI configurator, and this is found on the Extron DVD, which is uploaded to archive.org in the download files control subdirectory, which you can see right here. So this is the DVD, and then we have the download folder, files, control, and here's those 2 pieces of software. The other piece of software that we need is the global configurator, and this is how we set up the Extron 505 controller. We'll use this to basically add all of our switchers and other pieces of hardware and tell the touch panel what they actually do. Now let's start with the GUI configurator to actually set up our touch panel. We can start a new project, open an existing project if we were already working on one, or download one from a panel if we lost our configuration at some point. But for now, let's just start a new project. Well, the first thing it's going to ask us is what kind of panel we have. So I have the 1000 series, and then there are the MV or the TV. The MV does not have a stand and instead mounts inside of a wall, and the TV has a little stand that lets it stand on its own. Once we select the panel that we're going to use, we then have to select a theme. There's a couple of presets here that we could choose from. But I suggest just starting off with a blank template because they're really meant for like the AV industry and not what we're doing. Now we have the actual software itself. On the right side here, we have this little page tab which has a preview of what the touch panel is going to look like. This setting at the top are the different controls, so we can add buttons, we can add static images, different labels, we can add a video preview using an IP video converter, which I don't have in my setup, but that is something that you can do. On this left side here, we have our project page. This allows us to add different pages to the touchscreen. So for instance, I could have a button down here that says, back, and another one over here that says next or forward, and I could have different pages on the touch panel if this wasn't enough room for me to work with. Finally, I have my properties section down here, which is probably where you're going to do most of your work, aside from the actual touch panel itself. This has two different tabs here, the appearance properties and the design properties, and anything that you click on or add has these two different pages, and we can use that to customize either how things look or how they're actually going to act. Let's set up an example touch panel that sort of mimics the one that I have already. So the first thing that I want to do personally is add a background image. Now, without anything selected here, as far as buttons or anything like that, you can see I have a little lock icon at this top left, which means I actually have the background selected. I have the appearance properties. There's a few different things that we can do here. We can add text to the page itself, which isn't very useful, but we can change the background color right here. We can go in and select it from a different list of colors. I think light salmon is the one that I used for my touchscreen. Yeah, that looks about right. If we want to add a background image, we have two different options. First off, you can create your own custom background image at 1024 by 600. At least that's the resolution of the 10-inch screen. Alternatively, I can change the color of the background and add a transparent image into just one of the corners or the middle of the screen, and then use the color function just to give myself a background. Now, I made my own custom background here, so let's go ahead and add that image. When I click on the three dots by the image button, the resource library screen comes up. This is where you load any audio or graphics that you want to add onto the touch panel. Let's go over to the graphics tab here, and there's the import button. We can import individual files, or we can import an entire folder. In this case, I just want a single file. I'll navigate over to my background here. We'll load that in. So now I can click OK, and there you go. So because I made this image 1024 by 600, it is perfectly centered on the screen here. But what if we didn't have it at the perfect resolution? Now, this is my YouTube background for the page, the channel page. And you can see it's 2048 by 1152. It's cut off a bunch of different ways. The top, bottom, left, and right are all cut off because this is set to native for the image layout. But we can go ahead and change this to fill, stretch, tile, native, or offset. When it's set to offset, it's set to the native resolution, but you can change the left and top. So if I set this to 500 pixels, you can see it goes down by 500, or negative 500 pixels, it'll go up by 500, or I can set it back to 0. We can also enable the transparency here, which if you had like a PNG or something with a white background and you just wanted the files in the middle, you can enable this, and you can see it's cutting out the white color from my nose and eyes in this. Now that I have my background set up, I think the first thing we want to do is add some buttons. So let's go ahead and take one of these buttons. What I suggest doing is adding a single button and then opening up a calculator and doing some math. We can figure out how many buttons we want and then divide the resolution by the size of those buttons, or by the amount of those buttons, and get the pixel count for what we actually want to do here. If I click on this button here, I can customize the width and height, and I know that this panel is 1024 by 600. Let's think about how many buttons we want. In my case, I think a 5 by 5 grid of buttons would be enough. I'm going to set up 1024 divided by 5, which is going to get me a fraction, which obviously you can't do a fraction in pixels. We're going to have to do a little bit of creative thinking here, but let's just say 204 pixels. That's if you wanted the buttons to touch each other. I like leaving a little bit of space, so I'm probably going to go with 190 pixels. So we'll do 190, and then 600 divided by 5 is 120. But again, I like having a little bit of space, so we'll do 110. So let's do 190 by 110. There we go. And then we can click on our current button that we made and copy and paste it. We'll make a row of 5. And now I want to space these out evenly. I roughly spaced these out, but what we can actually do is look at the layout here, which tells me the left corner, where the left corner is at, and we can actually do some math to figure this out. So 190 times 5 is 950. So we have 74 pixels left over, and we have 4 gaps. So 74 divided by 4, 18.5. So we could do 18 pixel gaps, and then one of them is going to need to have a little bit more room. Or we could do 18, 18, and then 19 and 19. But we'll do 18 pixels between these two, so 190 plus 18, and then we will do 19 pixels, 208 plus 19, 227. Then we want to do a 19 pixel gap between these two here. I know that this is 208 plus 190, 398, and then plus 19, 417. This needs to go to 417. There we go. And then I want another 19 pixel gap between these two right here. I want 417 plus 190 plus 19, 626. And then the remaining gap I know is already correct because the button snapped to the right side of the screen. Now I know these are all evenly spaced. I can select all of them, copy paste them, and then we can do the same spacing trick. All right, there we go. Our buttons are now evenly spaced out. I can press Control A to select all of my buttons here, and now we can customize what they look like. We have the options here to change the text font, so I can actually add text to these. If I double click one of the buttons, I can say, add some text here. We can change the font. You can type in the size if it's not in this list, of course. We can change the color of it. We can change the alignment. Dynamic text, I'm not really sure how to use, but it says that it allows you to change it remotely. You can play around with that if you want. We can add images to this, which is what I did with my consoles. We can change the border type. We can change the fill color, which is the actual inside. Absolutely horrific. I'm glad we created this. And we can also change the transparency. Now you can see it's only going to change it on one of the buttons here, but when I click away, it'll automatically do all the other buttons for me. As far as uploading your custom images, there is a library online full of PNGs, extremely high resolution PNGs of every single console and PC icon that has ever existed. I have that downloaded, and I'm going to import that into here. So let's go ahead and import this folder here. There we go, 87 graphics were imported. Let's hit escape to get rid of the selection and just select the Super Nintendo. I'll go to the images, and let's do the Super Famicom instead. So here's the Super Famicom. You can see a couple of things. First off, it defaulted to the native image layout, which we already know is going to be the wrong size. And secondly, the text is still there, so we'll need to get rid of that. First, let's get rid of the text, and let's change the image layout to fill. There we go. And let's also add one for the Mega Drive. Now we would go through and finish customizing all of our buttons here. We can put them into whatever layout that we want. You don't have to do a grid like I did here. You can really get crazy with it and get creative if you so choose, but this is just an example of the basics. Once we're done, we need to do a few things. First off, you should go to File and then save the project. The next thing you're going to want to do is export the project. What you're doing is exporting it as a file that the controller can actually import and use. That controller is going to need to import this so it knows where all the buttons are and what can be programmed. Make sure you export this somewhere as well. I usually export it to the same place that I save the project because they're two completely different file formats. The final thing that you need to do is send this image and this layout of the buttons to your touch panel. The way that you do this is by going to this project page right up at the top and setting the IP address of your touch panel. Once you set that IP address, you can go down to Project and then Upload to Selected Panels, and then you'll see it reflected on the touch panel itself. You may be wondering how to get the IP address for your touch panel. Well, you're actually going to set that yourself. I have my touch panel right here, and we're going to turn it around, and there's going to be an options button. Here we have the back of the touch panel, and you can see that there is a menu button right here. I'm going to use this screwdriver to press that. We can change a few different things on here. So we have the menu, or the main settings here for the sleep timer, the backlight, whether it wakes on motion, things like that. And most importantly in here, we set up our network settings. You can turn on DHCP if you have a DHCP router. The best thing to probably do is to assign a static IP to it. So you can see I have my static IP set there, along with the subnet mask. Once we're done, press exit. It's going to load the configuration again, and you're good to go. Now that we've backed up this file, exported it somewhere, and uploaded it to the touch panel itself, we can use the Global Configurator 3 software in order to set up the controller to actually use this and do a bunch of different things. So let's close out of this piece of software and open up the Global Configurator. Here's the Global Configurator software. We're creating a new project. The first thing we need to do here is set this IP up to whatever IP our controller is using. So we need to set the IP of the controller, of course. In order to get the IP, we're going to need to factory reset this to defaults because God only knows what IP it has coming from eBay. What I suggest doing is this reset to factory defaults down here. You hold the reset button for 9 seconds until the LED blinks 3 times, and then release and tap it again within a second. So you're going to hold, count to 9. Once the third blink happens, let go and tap the button. And this will reset the IP back to default. The default IP address for the system is 192.168.254.254, and you'll go to that web page in order to set up the IP. The first time that you type the IP address in and try to go to it, you may get this white screen here. If you get this white screen instead of something about the connection failing or whatever, that's actually a good thing. That means you're connected to the box, but the page just isn't loading. And I don't know why this happens, but it is not just me that this has happened to. What you can do to get out of this situation is go to the IP address and just type / anything you want. So we'll just do test.htm and then hit enter. And you see it's going to give me an error here telling me no page matches my request. But it says to click here to return to the status page. So now it brings me to the status page, no rtxe_index.html. This is a page you can bookmark, and you'll get brought to this page every time. We can go to configuration, and then change the IP address here, the gateway IP, and the subnet to match your network. Then you just click submit, and then go to the new IP address, do that same trick, and bookmark it, and you should be good to go. In the Global Configurator 3 software, we're going to put our IP address in. We can set a DNS if we choose, although I usually leave that blank. We don't need any of this other stuff turned on, and we can just press OK. It's going to ask us what kind of device we want to have added here. We're going to add the 505. We can go ahead and put that in a folder with the name of our location, so I'll put office. And then click OK. Now that we've added it, this may seem overwhelming, but these are just empty ports that we have the option to do something with. So we can go ahead and minimize these if we choose. We have the 505 selected, so this is all of the different settings that are set on the controller right now. Now we can get to adding all of our devices. We have a few different devices here. We have a touch panel, and we have the cross-point switcher that's hooked up via Ethernet. Let's keep it simple and just add our switch and our touch panel. The first thing I want to add is the switch. I'll go into this Ethernet port here and look for the device in this list. Because I know it's made by Extron, we can narrow it down by picking it here. And because we know it's a matrix switcher, we can go down there and pick the matrix switcher. And I have an 84 HVA. The difference between the HV and the HVA is that the HVA is one that has audio. So if you have audio ports on yours, you're going to select HVA. Here's something interesting about adding this 84. I'm going to open this right now, put in the IP address, and now I have a bunch of different things that I can do here. But if we go to the presets, you can see I can only select 16 different presets. Now I know that the 84 HVA, if you go into the web interface, has many more than 16 presets to choose from. I don't know why it's limited to this, but what we can do to get around this, if you need to use more than 16 presets, is go down to the Ultra 6464 HVA and use that instead. And even though I only have an 84 HVA, I can select the 6464 because it's going to send the same exact commands as it would for any of the other crosspoints. And now I have access to 32 presets instead of just 16. And that's all we need to do to set up the cross point itself. Next, we can set up the touch panel. So let's go down to touch panel port 1. And it's going to tell me that I don't have a panel associated. So let's go ahead and add one. It's going to pull up here which version it is. So let's do the 1000 TV. We'll set the IP address and the display name. Once we're done setting the IP, we can check a few boxes down here. First, we can enable virtual touch link and synchronize the panel when reconnected. TouchLink allows you to use the Extron app on either your iPhone or your iPad in order to control the touch panel. So what it'll do is bring up an exact replica of your touch panel on the screen that you can interact with. There is an Android version of this app, but it does not work anymore for some reason, but the iOS version still works on the latest version of iOS as of 2024, as well as on iPads. Now, I'm getting an error that it can't connect to the touch panel because that's not the right IP, but I'm going to continue anyway. And it'll still let me do everything I need to show you guys what we're doing. Now the touch panel is added, and you can see here that we have a blank white screen and an add layout button. The layout is the file that we created earlier where we put all of our buttons in place and added a background and all of that stuff. Let's go ahead and add a layout. We can import a layout. We can bring it in from a touch panel or from our hard drive. And you can see here that I have a couple of projects. These TGZ files are what you exported from the program earlier. Let's go ahead and open one of them up. And you can see this is the example that I already had on my touch panel itself. We'll click OK. And now you can see that I have my pages here. I have all of my buttons. I can click on the buttons to interact with them. And I have down here all of the devices that I can add and interact with the touchscreen. So under driver, I have anything I've added via Ethernet or serial or IR. I can turn on different relays that are attached to the 505 box, as well as the 12-volt power. We can add time delays to our commands when we send them. We can actually interact with the panel via WAV files or different show page buttons that are on the panel itself, as well as set it to sleep. Here's our serial ports. User-defined commands are what you would use, for instance, for the Mister, because there's obviously not a pre-built Extron driver for the Mister. So I can take any of these serial ports and say, hey, on serial 8, I want to send a command of dash open layout or something like that, and then drag that in here. Now when I press this button, it'll open the layout on serial port 8. And we can also control different states of the buttons, whether the buttons are on and off, which essentially means whether the button is lit up or not. So let's set up this PlayStation button as an example. I'm going to go into driver, I'm going to find my Extron. There are a few different things that I can do with this button. First, I can go into the Extron web interface and set a layout up. Open that layout, it will send the PlayStation to all of my TVs. And so what I can do after I set that layout up is go into this button, go to the preset and tell it to open preset 1 when I press the PlayStation button. That's one option. Instead of setting up a preset is tell it what input it's on. Let's say it's on input 1. And then I need to set up a couple of more buttons for my outputs. This PVM is going to be output 1. The TV will be output 2. And then I need to set up a third button for take, which is going to send whatever is highlighted here to the other devices. So I'll set it to take audio and video when I press that button. As it stands with the way that we've programmed this, when you press these buttons, they're not going to light up or tell you that they've been clicked. So what we can also do is go to state control, find the button, and set it to turn on. Now, I didn't label my buttons here very well. I would suggest that you might want to go back and label your buttons properly so you know what they are. I just happen to know what these are because I've worked with this before. But essentially when I click these now, it's going to select the output and set the button to on. And then what I want to do is have the take button turn off any button that may be lit up. There may be an easier way to do this, but this is what I found works for me. So you can go through and set all of your buttons up the way that you want. You can go through here and look at all the different commands that you may want to use. Once we've set all of our buttons up, there's a couple things we want to do. First, make sure you go to File and Save As and back up this GCZ file somewhere. We then need to go to Build and then All Configurations. This is going to take all of the files here, all the changes that we've made, and build them out into a project file. it's also going to upload them to the 505. Now you can see that I got an error there because the IP address isn't right, but let's go ahead and actually open up my proper GCZ file, and we'll use that to show you how this works. Here's my actual file. I'm going to go to Build, All Configurations, and you can see it's building the 505 with the proper IP address now. There we go. And it also sent any changes that needed to be done to the touch panel. So I'm going to click Begin, and my touch panel just turned off, and it doesn't think there's any configuration loaded because this is currently uploading. Now this is going to tell me that it was done with a few warnings. I don't know what these warnings mean. They pop up from time to time, but as long as it says that it was successful, you should be good to go. If you get any other kind of error here, like an IP error, that just means your network information is not correct. Now it's going to take about 30 to 60 seconds for everything to boot back up. The 505 is going to reset, as well as the touchscreen, and the touchscreen can't work without the 505 being initialized. That's how you set up the basics of the touchscreen, along with a cross-point switcher. We can also add custom serial commands, or IR commands, as well as add any other devices via the serial port, which we'll end up doing later with an Extron MVX switcher, because that doesn't have an Ethernet port. Most of your work is probably going to be done on this page here, trying to set up custom things, as well as timing and different kinds of buttons. Just play around with it. You can't really break anything, just make sure you're saving backups of all of your files so that, you can always restore back to a touch panel that you know works. Now we can go ahead and actually use the touch panel and test it out. It should all be working. If something isn't working, just go ahead and check all of your code and enjoy the touch panel. That should be everything you need to know in order to get started with setting up the touch panel and setting up the controller. We're going to set up a few other things later on, like custom IR commands for your remote controls, like your TV, your AV receiver, potentially IR lights and things like that. We're also going to set up the MiSTer and do things with the serial ports. And we will talk about some other Extron products like the RGB devices and the VSC scan converters. So we'll do some stuff with that in a later video. If you run into any issues or have any questions, put them down in the comments and I'll try to help if I can. If I can't help, hopefully someone else can when they come by and see this video. If you do end up going through with this yourself and make a little touch panel and things like that, please post it in the comments with like a link to a Reddit post or wherever you end up putting it to show other people. I'm specifically interested in seeing what else other people do. And that should be everything. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please give the video a like and consider subscribing for more stuff like this in the future. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.